Some time ago, I was over at a friend's house for dinner. We were dining in his kitchen, and he has the nice chairs in the kitchen, similar to the stool, the high-rise chairs with the raised countertops. Anyways, we were cooking and eating dinner, and then I noticed off to the side, he has a nice picture frame with the following words: "If you feed them, they will come." Now, of course, I immediately asked him, I said, where did you get that picture, that image? And his response is actually kind of funny. He says, well, he got it at his neighbor's house when they were moving. They have this nice picture frame, and he liked the frame more than he liked the words, but it looks very fancy, so he wanted to keep it. Now, he didn't know where to put it, so he just put it right in his kitchen. And the words are, again, "If you feed them, they will come." Now, this is interesting because I can honestly tell you in my own personal experience, this statement, "if you feed them, they will come," is kind of true. I tell you, whenever I give talks or a lecture or, an event, whenever there's food, it seems apparent that more people show up. Now, think about it. Well, why not, right? I mean, free food. I guess too, people would show up to events for free food. Why not? Well, anyways, now in the Gospel of St. John chapter 6, we see something similar here. It begins with the story of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, where Jesus performed his miracle and fed a large crowd of people. Now, after doing so, as you can imagine, the people now always want to be with Jesus. They always want to be next to Jesus. Why is that? Because Jesus fed them. They were satisfied, physically satisfied, right? Jesus fed them. He fed their physical needs. And so they were hungry and he gave them food. And now they become satisfied, which they figure, okay, well, to solve their hunger problem, they'll just always be next to Jesus, right? And so that's their thinking. So their physical needs are resolved. But as you can see, they become hungry again in just a short while later. It's kind of like for all of us, we eat food and then we get hungry again very soon. And so what is this passage all about? Well, it's a segue into something much more important in the Gospel of John chapter 6. And here's the spoiler alert, right? It's about the Holy Eucharist. It's about the Holy Eucharist, and we'll get there eventually. Now, in case you're interested in learning more about the Holy Eucharist, I made a reflection on the Feast of Corpus Christi, and I'll put a link to it in the description below. If you take a look at that, you'll learn a lot from that very reflection on the Eucharist and the theology of the Eucharist and what it all means. I really encourage you to read that. Now, let's get back to the Gospel of St. John chapter 6. And so here's the story. You have the disciples crossing the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But of course, by this time, the disciples were also making the effort to cross themselves as well because they want to follow Jesus. They realize that Jesus could satisfy their physical needs, so why not follow him? Right? In fact, if you continue reading the gospel passage, in John chapter 6, starting verses 14, 15, and then onwards, we see this passage play out pretty clearly, right? Here's what it says. When the people saw the sign that Jesus had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." And here's the next important line. Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. And so now you have the disciples crossing the sea to the other side, and there was a great huge storm. Right? And then as we continue reading the passage, we see they go into the other side. And then starting in verse 22, we have the bread of life discourse. Right? And in this bread of life discourse, it continues to the very end of John chapter 6. And the most important line of this whole chapter is verse 35. And here's what it says. Jesus reveals to the disciples this very fact. I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. Now, friends, in the Gospel of St. John, there are many I ams. Right? There are many I ams. So let me just go through quickly some of them. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. John chapter 6, verses 35. Jesus also says, I am the light of the world. You can find that in John chapter 8, verses 12. Jesus also says, I am the door of the sheep. That's found in John chapter 10, verse 7. And then here's an important one. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. You can find that in the Gospel of John chapter 11, verse 25. This one is very important. I am the resurrection and the life. You see, Jesus reminds us that death is not final, that those who have faith in Jesus Christ will experience eternal life. This is really important, right? And so it's used often in at funerals. Now, next one, I am the good shepherd. You can find that in John chapter 10, verses 11. And then here's another important one. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You can find that in John chapter 14, verse 6. Very, very important. I am the way and the truth and the life. You often hear that preached in various different ways. Very important passage. And then finally, Jesus also says, I am the true vine. That's found in John chapter 15, verse 1. And then also in verse 5 as well. Now, there are 7 I ams which I just shared there. I'll go deeper into each one, perhaps in another reflection. But here, let's shift back to the gospel reading for the 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year B. And the reading is in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. Verse 1 to 15. So let's do a reflection on that. And before we get started, just a reminder too, to please be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel to receive weekly reflections on faith. Okay, and so what we've spoken of earlier, again, here's a quick summary of this gospel passage. There is a large crowd following Jesus because he was performing signs, that is, miracles, on the sick. And then a large crowd followed Jesus. Now, it gets later in the day as the crowd's following Jesus and they're listening to him, teach them, and they haven't eaten anything yet, and so they're hungry, right? So the disciples are hungry. So what does Jesus do? Well, perhaps you're familiar with the story. It's the story on the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. This miracle you can also find in the other gospel readings as well. And so then in this particular gospel passage from John chapter 6, verse 1 to 15, I'd like to share 4 important points for us to reflect on further. Point number 1, Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee and a large crowd followed him. Now, why a large crowd following Jesus? Well, because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. They saw the signs, and so now they want to find out more. In a certain sense, they themselves want to go and see the signs for themselves as well. Now, here's something interesting to note. The Gospel of St. John can be divided into 2 parts. The first part you have is considered the book of signs, right? These include the miracles, which are referred to as signs in the Gospel of St. John. And there are a total of 7 signs, or a total of 7 miracles, in other words. Now, I know it gets very technical. There is a distinction between signs and miracles and why the Gospel of St. John prefers to use signs. We'll get into that at another time. But in here, I want to just briefly mention the 7 signs in the Gospel of St. John. The first is the sign at the wedding feast at Cana. The second is the healing of an official's son. And then the third is the healing of a sick man. The fourth is the feeding of the 5,000, which we're just reading here. And then the fifth is the walking on the Sea of Galilee, which is the next passage. And then the sixth sign is the healing of the man born blind in chapter 9. And then finally, the seventh is the resurrection of Lazarus, which you can find in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 11, starting in verse 38. Now, let's not forget the greatest sign of all, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Easter resurrection. Anyways, so going back to what we were talking about, there's a large crowd following Jesus, and their motivation for following Jesus is, well, it's different for each one of them, right? But generally, they have the same motivation. They want to see for themselves. They want to witness the signs that Jesus is performing. And perhaps too, they are in need of the healing. And so they're coming to Jesus. So their intentions are various. Now, let's move on. Point number two. The problem here is that there is no food in this place where they are saying there's no food. And that's the problem. Now, imagine a deserted place and there's no food around. There is no fast food, no restaurants, no way to get access to food. So then what can the disciples do? Well, they need food because they are starving, right? And if you have a starving crowd, well, pretty soon they're going to leave. So then comes an important point in the gospel reading, right? And it's this. Jesus turns to his disciple and says, where can we buy enough food for them to eat? It's a very, very practical question, right? Where can we find more food to eat? And Philip answered Jesus. He says, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each one of them to have a little. But then one of the disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is this for so many? And then if you continue reading this gospel passage, we see the sign, right? We see the miracle, in other words. And so point number 3 I'd like to share here is the miracle, or rather the sign of the multiplication of the loaves. Now remember, we just mentioned it, the Gospel of St. John prefers the use of the word sign. So what happened in this sign? Well, Jesus fed the multitudes. He multiplied the bread. With 5 bread and 2 fish, he was able to feed the multitude, the large crowd. And so after eating as much of the bread and fish as they could, the people were filled. They were full. They were fully satisfied. They were no longer hungry, no longer physically hungry. It's like an all-you-can-eat event, so to speak, right? So they're fully satisfied. They're no longer physically hungry, which then brings us to the 4th and final point I'd like to share here. Pay attention towards the last part of the gospel passage. Here's what it says. They were going to carry him off and made him king. They want to make Jesus king. Well, what's Jesus' response? Well, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. You see, so oftentimes in our own personal lives, we want glory for having done something great, right? Like a good deed. We want the honor of doing something great. But see, Jesus performs the sign, but he does not want this honor, at least the honor in the worldly sense, right? Not in the worldly sense. And Jesus also reminds us to work for honor, to work for treasure, to work for that which endures forever, for all eternity. And so Jesus is a king, but not king in this worldly sense, right? Jesus is a different kind of king, the king of all eternity. And so, friends, in the 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time Year B, we read the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 1 to 15, and we see that Jesus satisfied the crowd in their physical needs. But he's going to challenge them soon to something deeper than just working for food that perishes. And I'd like to invite you to reflect on this very question. Why are you following Jesus? Why are you following Jesus? Think about this deeply. Because like the crowd who is following Jesus, they do it for various different reasons until Jesus challenges them to go deeper in their faith. And he does the same thing with us. And so why are you following Jesus? May God bless you.